Over the last 4 years, I've interviewed and coached 350 plus podcasters. I'm also the co-host of Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing, a podcast that generates $10,000 of attributed sales each and every month, meaning we're turning listeners into clients. I'm also the co-founder of the leading podcasting book brand on Amazon under the pen of Daniel Larson, having multiple best-selling books and having sold tens of thousands of copies. So here are 29 podcasting growth tips in just 24 minutes. So let's dive straight in. Don't play it safe with interviews. Ask follow-up questions during interviews to uncover deeper insights. Most podcasters sometimes try to play it safe, when in actuality, asking those deep, meaningful questions that probe on specific pain points or stories is the way to get the most out of your guests and provide a unique experience for your listeners. Record solo episodes and see how they perform. If you're an entrepreneur with a podcast, it's so important they have solo episodes where it's just you speaking directly to your audience, because you get to dictate the quality of the content and aren't always relying on high profile guests to try and grow your podcast, which again, we both know typically doesn't work. Solo episodes allow you to increase the touch point between yourself and your audience, build your authority, as well as establish new expertise, you being the person of value. Experiment with one growth strategy at a time. Focus is your best friend. Most podcasters get screwed over because they're doing way too many things and can't really figure out what variable, what specific action they're taking that actually drives more growth for their podcast. But when you have focus, you end up doing way less, but getting way more, because again, you're focusing on one strategy at a time. Therefore, you can figure out whether it works, absolutely, or whether it's absolute garbage and a complete waste of time. Never miss an episode upload. It completely kills momentum. It's as simple as that. Keep uploading as much as you can. And if you have live circumstances, because life does happen, where, for example, something happens where you have, one of your kids are ill or you have a vacation, simply re-upload past episodes and frame it as something that's exciting for your audience, i.e., hey, this is a fan favorite episode from 6 months ago that I really want to share with you. This way, you keep the consistency and you keep building momentum. So never miss an upload. If you're stuck with slow and steady growth, that's probably a sign you should start experimenting with different strategies and even topics you cover on the show. Most people don't know this, but oftentimes your growth can be heavily dictated by the topics you cover on the show. So ask yourself, what topics within my industry are hot and trending right now? And how can I start covering them more on my podcast? By doing this, you're leveraging hot and trending topics and you're taking advantage of these trends. And by covering these topics on your podcast, you can capture demand that's already there for these topics. Have a clear target audience for your podcast. Who is it for? What topics are you covering? What problem do you solve? And what makes your show different from everyone else? When you're able to figure out these differentiating factors, it allows you to cut through the noise, because there's so many shows out there. And when you can stand out and have clarity on who your show's for, what topics you cover, what specific problem you solve, and what makes your show different from everyone else, and you communicate that through your show name, title, episodes, this is how you're able to gain traction so much faster. Be more of yourself and show your unique personality to attract the right audience and to repel people who will never be fans. I always say be more of yourself, and people are like, what do you mean by that? Sometimes, when you're on a podcast or you're recording a YouTube video or creating content, it's really important you exaggerate the deeper side of yourself. If you're someone who sometimes get wound up and likes to vent, then go crazy and vent. If you're someone who likes to be super analytical and super logical, then be super analytical and super logical. The point is, being more of yourself allows you to attract more of the people you want to reach and repel those who would never vibe with your personality. Being authentic is such a powerful way to attract the right audience. And when you're able to consistently be authentic, you build up a loyal audience base. Don't hold back value thinking it's going to help you make more money in the short term and in the long term. It honestly won't. It will only lead to slow growth, low engagement, and no money being made from your show. Now, I totally get why some people might want to hold back value from their podcast. Maybe you're worried that if you share so much value, then why would someone want to work with you on a one-on-one basis? Maybe you're concerned that, hey, this is my secret source. My competitors might be listening to my podcast. And if I give away that secret source, now they have that piece of information. So you default to not giving as much value to the show and withholding value. What I found from my experiences, this only screws you over, because what's happening is when a new listener discovers your podcast and discover a new show like yours and they try it out, but if the sample you've gave these new listeners isn't great and isn't captivating and isn't the actual source, why will they keep coming back for more? Because let's face it, it's you versus everyone else in your industry who are targeting the listeners you want to reach. So they're constantly comparing your show versus everyone else. But when you give freely and go crazy with this, you tend to find that your show can grow so much faster because guess what? People will share your content. Guess what? They're going to promote it on social media. Guess what? You're going to get way more people coming back for more because you're giving them the best you have to offer. And by doing so, you gain way more traction. People are far more likely to want to work with you. And you feel so much better in the process. I would also argue is way harder trying to keep back information than speaking freely on your show. Add subtitles to your show name to further clarify who your show is for, why people should listen, or to add additional keywords to your podcast. This will help you rank for the right keywords, but more importantly, when a new listener discovers your show, they have further clarity that the show is for them. An example could be a podcast that's titled Woman Waken. I kind of maybe get the vibe, but if you further clarify, Woman Waken, how to overcome past trauma and heal from controlling relationships. Something like that further clarifies who the show is actually for and makes it so much clearer for your audience. You don't need to jam-pack your intros with guest credentials, backstories. Just focus on what your listeners will gain. Now, look, I'm going to be honest. I'm a complete and utter hater when it comes to people having super drawn-out intros, talking about credentials, talking about backstory, PhD this. The honest truth is, more times than not, if you're an independent podcast, an entrepreneur with a show, it's all about focusing on what the listeners will gain. Like, why should they care about this guest? Because if they know the guest, then you providing the intro and the backstory and credentials, it doesn't really do much because they know the guest. So it doesn't really add anything of value to the listeners who already know the guest, right? And if they don't know the guest, they don't really care as much. They're just thinking to themselves, okay, what's this guest going to talk about that's going to add value to my life and how my life be improved after listening to the show? So instead of just talking about your guests and the credentials and them and this and that, focus way more on what your listeners will gain from the guests themselves. Long intros lead to high drop-off in retention time, meaning essentially, when you look on your analytics on Apple and Spotify, you get a metric that tells you, on average, how much of your content do your listeners consume. If you have a super long intro talking about the credentials and this and that and who cares, right? You'll have a high percent of people who click and start listening who would actually drop off because you've lost their interest. Again, this is why it's so important to sell the listen to your show by telling your listeners what they'll actively gain. A simple way to do this is by adding what we call 3 open loop hooks, where you state 3 clear benefits your audience are going to gain by the end of the episode. Most podcasters struggle to grow, not because they aren't getting enough exposure, but because they struggle to keep listeners, new listeners, coming back for more. So it doesn't matter how much promotion, the high profile guests you get on, you guessing on Joe Rogan, if your podcast fundamentally is unable to keep listeners binging your content week after week, your show will never grow, because how will you grow a podcast that can't keep listeners coming back for more? So instead of focusing on exposure, focus on keeping listeners in. How do you create hyper engaging content where every episode is targeting a specific listener that consistently gets those listeners coming back for future episodes? That is how you fast track your podcast growth. And that's how you make your promotional pieces, the guests you get on and the podcast you collaborate with in order to grow your show and get exposure. That's how you make it actually matter, by focusing on keeping listeners coming back for more. Recap some of your best performing episodes in just 5 minutes as a separate episode. This is an easy way for you to piggyback off a previously high performing episode. What do I mean? If you notice that when you talk about a specific topic or you have a specific guest on, and your episodes on average just go from, let's say you're averaging 100 downloads per episode, but when you talk or when you get a specific guest on, you're now averaging, let's say, 300 downloads for that episode. That's a clear sign that either the topic or the guest are super popular. So what should you do? Well, you can cover a recap. Maybe let's say a month goes by. You can have a recap episode where you look at, okay, what are my best performing episodes in the past? And then how can I recap them in 5 minutes, sharing my takeaways, sharing my views, sharing my perspective on what the guest shared on our episode. Again, an easy way to piggyback off a high performing episode. Don't rely on social media promotions to grow your show. Focus on online communities instead. So what do I mean? Social media promotions is one of the number one use strategies, quote unquote, podcasters use to try and grow their podcast. The issue is it's a terrible way to grow. I'm not even going to try to argue this. All I'll ask you is, can you name me 5 new podcasts you've discovered in the last bloody 2 years that you listen to on a regular basis because you saw them promoting on social media? It just doesn't happen, right? So what we do instead is focus way more on online communities where your audience are. provide value, engage other people, share specific content based on your podcast, and then reach out to members who are engaging with you on a consistent basis. This way, you're expanding your reach, tapping into online communities where your audience already are, and you're only reaching out to members, not promoting to everyone, only the members who engage with your content because they've basically qualified as someone who's interested in your show. Interview community owners to get them to share your podcast on their audience. Again, when you find these online hotspots, find admin members, interview them if they are open to talking on your podcast because they get exposure, you get exposure, but more importantly, you're able to then tap into their audience that they themselves have already built. When pitching to be a guest on other podcasters' shows, don't forget to follow up multiple times. Look, people get super busy. So if you're emailing them or reaching out on social media, be sure to follow up multiple times. And this can be spaced out between 2 to 3 days. It can be as simple as, hey, just want to check my last email came through. By the way, here's a quick reminder of what I pitched. And then just give them a quick reminder. Again, people are super busy. Just because you didn't get a response the first time, it doesn't mean they don't care. Oftentimes, following up a second and third time is what you need in order to get them to respond in a positive way. Do compare your podcast to other shows in your niche. Now, this sounds a bit bizarre. You're probably thinking, and dude, what the hell? Why the hell would you want me to compare myself to other people? I thought comparison is the joy of failure. I thought comparison is the stealer. What's that saying? I thought comparison is a stealer of joy. I feel like I'm butchering that, but you get what I'm trying to say. But no, I believe you absolutely 100% should be comparing your podcast and your standards to other podcasts in your industry. Look at authority figures in your space. Who's the number one podcast in the business space, anxiety, personal development, whoever it might be. And ask yourself, what are the standards they are holding up for themselves? How often are they uploading? How good does their audio quality sound? How well produced is their show? Do they have a team? What topics are they covering? Which topics do they cover that actually gets the most amount of attention? All of this is data, and you do this for two specific reasons. Number one, most podcasters think their shows are excellent, and I'm not doubting that. Your show probably is really good. However, if you're just comparing your podcast to your podcast, then it's not really much of a comparison. But when you're constantly looking at the top people in your industry and what they're doing and how they're achieving, it almost triggers, to me anyway, it almost triggers a competitive nature because you realize, oh, actually, this is the standards that we're operating at, and my podcast at the moment might be here. So how do I raise my standards in order to be like one of the best and like one of the greatest within my industry? And number two, it gives you data to work with. If you find a authority figure in your space, their YouTube channel or their podcast, and you realize that it's super, super popular or is blown up or is getting lots of attention on social media, it's probably a sign that that specific episode or that specific guest had done a really good job. So what should you do? You should analyze a topic and actually think about how you can make spin-off topics based on what they spoke about. But you should also analyze what worked really well. You know, were they sharing lots of stories? Was it more strategic? Was it more tactical? And you can use their data, right, to improve your show and to tweak it based on what you know, your audience, because again, if they're in your space, that means a lot of your listeners will be listening to their show. It gives you an idea of what their audience loves. And it gives you an idea of what your audience will most likely resonate with as well. Do compare your podcast episode topics with each other. Every 30 to 60 days, you should be reviewing past episodes. Look at what's performing well and ask yourself why. And then ask yourself, well, how do I cover more of that on my show? And if you realize that, okay, I've got a personal development podcast, I'll talk about, how to get better sleep. I'll talk about healthy eating. I'll talk about anxiety. I talk about OCD. And you realize that anxiety is way more popular, then just focus way more on anxiety in order to grow your show. Because again, it's proven to gain traction. Don't compare your growth rate with other podcasts. Now, with other tip, I literally mentioned how you should compare yourself, but that's your standards, what they're doing, what you're not doing. What they're doing well, what's crushing, what's not working for them, that's what you should compare. But do not compare your growth rate to someone else's podcast because you have no idea what they have access to. Like if you're comparing yourself to, let's say, Stephen Bartlett, well, the guy already had a massive following on social media before he launched his podcast. Or if you compare yourself to someone else in your industry, you have no idea what they have access to. They could have an email list of hundreds of thousands of people, and with a send of a button, they're getting tens of thousands of downloads on their podcast. You don't know. So it's so important that you only compare your growth rate to yourself. Now, should you get annoyed and frustrated if things aren't working? Yeah, because I believe if you're angry and you're frustrated, it's going to drive you to take different sets of action. And when you take a different set of action, your podcast tends to grow or things change, right? But if you stay the same, then nothing changes. But again, do not compare your growth rate to other people's, because you're gonna end up just screwing yourself over. It's never a nice time. So focus on yourself and making your show the best it can possibly be, and then getting exposure on the podcast thereafter. Start every episode with a strong hook. Give people a promise or pose a question that will be answered within the episode. This is an easy way to grab the attention of your audience and to keep them engaged throughout the entire episode. The goal of your show notes isn't to give information about the episode or guest. The goal is to sell the listen to the episode. What do I mean? Again, think about this. Most people, when it comes to their show notes, their show episode description, they will kind of talk about their guest, or they'll talk about the topic, or they'll talk about the podcast itself. But think about it. This is an opportunity for you to basically create a sales letter for your episode. So do that. Sell the living crap out of your podcast episode. How do you do this? Well, you treat your show notes like a sales pitch for the episode. Focus on the benefits listeners will gain by listening to the podcast, and open loops that they have to close by listening to the episode. But how do you do this? Well, simply do this by adding intrigue in your show notes. You will discover 3 simple tricks you can start using today to grow your podcast. You'll understand why promoting your podcast on social media won't help you grow, and it's actually terrible advice. And the biggest growth murder mistakes that's commonly made by entrepreneurs of podcasts that you should avoid at all costs. You see there? That's in the show notes. I'm literally giving them a reason to listen. I'm creating intrigue around the topic of my episode. And if they want to scratch the itch to find out more about what I'm talking about, the only way for them to do that is by listening to the podcast episode. Edit dry interviews to highlight the best parts and expand on them yourself. So let's say, for example, you interview someone and they're super dry. It's a terrible interview. You know deep inside, oh my God, this is complete trash. Their audio is absolute whack. They themselves, maybe they're not used to being on an interview, or maybe they're not used to being on a podcast, and they just weren't great with stories or analogies, or, giving you specific steps and strategies, and they just weren't as confident. You can still save that interview, and that's by you simply highlighting the best parts. If there's only a 10-minute bit, highlight that. Edit that out, post-edit, right? And then give your thoughts on that. Provide context before you insert the interview, and then give your thoughts and takeaways afterwards. And this makes it a far more focused episode, but also means you can get the most out of the interview guest, and as a growth to give them a great episode without giving them a subpar interview. Share more stories on your podcast and share your failures. I think it's so important to be genuine about what you're going through with your show, with yourself, with your business. No one likes a goody two-shoot where that person is just completely bloody perfect. So I think it's important that you're just honest and constantly genuine with your audience. Whether you're trying to sell a product or service or whatever, you're just sharing freely and openly. And sometimes that just means sharing some failures along the way, because again, it allows your audience to connect on a deeper level to you. It allows them to empathize with your situation, and also it allows for you to be authentically yourself rather than trying to be this person who's completely perfect 100%. Have fun with your podcast and build relationships with your audience. I can't stress this enough. Look, your podcast should be fun. It should be something that you enjoy and look forward to doing every single day. So let's say there's a piece of the process. Let's say you're not growing, and then that's actually affecting how much you enjoy the podcast. Or maybe it's time to invest in a coach, or reading a book, or listening or watching a video like this. Maybe you don't like editing. Well, why are you editing yourself? If you're a business owner, an entrepreneur, and you've got a show, you should probably outsource that. That should be the first thing to bloody go, right? So you need to keep this so much more fun for yourself. If you've done a solo show and you find yourself being drained sometimes, maybe it's time to consider getting a co-host. I started my show, Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing. I started that off as a solo show, but I can tell you now, hands down, it's so much more fun as soon as I invited my business partner, Tygo Shea, to come on the podcast. And now we co-host the show, and it's 10 times easier, 10 times way more fun, and our audience love it. So figure out how to keep the podcast fun and enjoyable for yourself, to keep it going, because it's so important that you do so. Again, if you're not having fun with it, then what the hell are we doing here in the first place? Newsletters are a great way to keep your audience engaged, connected, and also to monetize the audience you have built. Look, selling directly from your podcast it can be tricky when you're speaking on an episode and then giving a call to action. Unless you have hundreds of thousands of listeners on the episode, your conversion rates, i.e. people who actually take the action, can be very low. But when you're able to give a freebie, a lead magnet on your podcast, and then get someone to join your email list really is the ecosystem you want your audience to be in. Because once they're in your ecosystem and they're getting newsletters and emails from you, you can sell, you can pitch, and it's so much easier to get them to engage with you and take that next step. So again, a newsletter is a great way to keep your audience engaged, connected, and also to monetize your podcast you have built. There is no perfect episode length. Make your podcast as long as it needs to be to deliver the value you want to deliver. Now, this is a caveat. I will say this. It is also important to review your actual retention time, because let's say, for example, most of your audience are listening to your podcast on a 20-minute commute and you have an hour and a half long podcast. If you look on Apple Podcasts Connect and look at your retention time and realize that people only listen for like 20 minutes consistently and there's a massive drop off in your retention, that's a clear sign that you should actually cater your episodes to be a bit shorter. Maybe it's half an hour instead of an hour and a half, because the length of your podcast does need to match the listener behavior that your audience have and exhibit. So you can experiment with different lengths to find what's perfect for you, but really within that time period, just deliver the amount of value that you can in a concise way. So if you had an episode as an hour and a half, but it needs to be half an hour, then just try to squeeze it in half an hour, or split episodes up into 3 separate parts that are all 13 minutes each. Your cover matters way more than you think. People judge books by their cover. Yeah, they just bloody do. I judge books by their cover. You judge books by their cover. Think about the thumbnails that you see on YouTube or on your podcast, directories. Most of the time, if the cover art that you have for your show isn't well branded, isn't crisp, isn't clear, isn't super professional, people will perceive it in that manner, because the guy next door or direct CEO or your competitors in your space, if their cover art just looks way better than yours and your cover art is the first thing people look at or see when deciding your podcast to listen to, they won't even pay attention to you in the first place if they don't think your cover art's really good. And if they see your cover art and it looks okay, and then they see someone else's cover art and that looks incredible, well, again, people judge books by their cover, so they're going to pick your competitors. So really focus on having a super beautiful cover art. 99 Design is a great place to go if you're looking to update your cover art. Guesting on other people's podcasts is one of the best ways to grow your podcast. This is huge because essentially you get to leverage someone else's audience, you get to build your authority, you get to build your network. Plus, when you're guesting on shows on a consistent basis, you're increasing the discovery points for your podcast. Because every single podcaster that you go to be a guest on, they have their own separate audience. They have their own unique audience. And when the spotlight is on you and you deliver a high level of value to their audience, well, guess what? They're now going to check out your show. And guess what? You now have multiple touch points / entry points that new listeners can discover you, your message, and your podcast. So again, it's a perfect way for you to consistently get in front of thousands of active podcast listeners. So look, there you have it. I hope you've enjoyed that. Look, my name is Anthony Ranieri. I'm the co-founder of GetMoreListeners.com, a company helping entrepreneurs of podcasts turn a slow growth show into a rapidly growing positive ROI show. Over the last 4 years, I've interviewed and coached 350 plus podcasters. And that's why I wanted to share this with you. If you enjoyed it, feel free to leave a like and a comment down below at what your favorite tip was. Peace, you rock.